They took everything from me, my husband, my home, my safety. They thought they'd silenced me forever. But they made one fatal mistake. They left me alive. Now I've returned, and my revenge isn't violence, it's education. They burned our school. I built an academy. They wanted me broken. I became unbreakable. This is how I turned tragedy into revolution. Like this video if you believe education is the most powerful weapon against oppression, and subscribe to hear more stories of extraordinary courage. I still remember the day they told me girls couldn't dream. I was 7 years old, sitting cross-legged in the dust outside our family's mud brick home in rural Afghanistan. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and jasmine as I watched my brothers walk to school, books clutched to their chests. When I stood to follow them, my uncle gently pushed me back down. "Not for you, Amina," he whispered, his eyes not meeting mine. "Your place is here." That moment branded itself into my soul, not with acceptance, but with a question that would burn inside me for years. Why not me? My village nestled between jagged mountains seemed both a sanctuary and a prison. We lived by rules as ancient and unyielding as the peaks surrounding us. Girls were shadows there, moving quietly, speaking softly, disappearing when visitors came. Our greatest achievement was to be invisible. Our highest calling was silence. But I was born with a fire that silence couldn't extinguish. At night, I would sneak into the small storage room where my father kept farming records. By candlelight, I traced the shapes of letters I didn't understand, imagining worlds beyond our valley. My mother caught me once. I expected anger, but instead, tears filled her eyes. "My brave, foolish daughter," she whispered, pulling me close. The smell of cardamom and wool enveloped me as she held me. "Some dreams are dangerous here." She was right. When I turned 12, everything changed. The Taliban's shadow grew longer across our region. Men with hard eyes and covered faces began appearing in the village square. They spoke of purity and devotion while their fingers caressed their weapons. One evening, I overheard my parents arguing in hushed, frantic tones. "They came to Malik's house," my father hissed. "They said his daughter was seen reading. They threatened to make an example of her." My mother's voice shook. "And of any family harboring such disobedience." 3 days later, in the hollow darkness before dawn, my mother shook me awake. Her face was wet with silent tears. "Listen carefully, Amina. You're going to Pakistan, to your father's cousin in Peshawar. Say nothing. Pack nothing that will draw attention." The journey remains a blur of fear, hidden under blankets in the back of a truck, crossing borders in the dark, the constant whispered warnings to stay silent, invisible, forgettable. Peshawar sprawled before me like another world, chaotic, colorful, terrifying. My father's cousin, a widow named Fatima, took me in with little enthusiasm but genuine kindness. Her apartment was small but clean, perched above a noisy market. "You can stay," she said simply, "but you must contribute. And you must be careful." I nodded, still disoriented by the lights, the noise, the sheer possibility surrounding me. "There's a school," she said, watching my face carefully. "For refugees. They take girls. If you want." My heart nearly burst through my chest. My first day at school, I wore the only clean dress I owned. My hands trembled so badly I could barely tie my headscarf. The school was nothing grand, just a converted warehouse with partitions creating makeshift classrooms. But to me, it was a palace. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and too many bodies in too small a space. The teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Nazreen, called each student's name. When she reached mine, I raised my hand, a gesture so small yet so monumental it made me dizzy. "Yes?" she asked, impatient with my silence. "Present," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. She nodded and moved on. She couldn't have known that in that moment, I had become more present in the world than I had ever been allowed to be. That afternoon, when Mrs. Nazreen asked a question about the text we were reading, I knew the answer. My arm rose slowly, as if fighting against the weight of generations telling me to stay hidden, stay silent, stay small. "Yes, Amina," she said. "The character feels trapped," I said, voice trembling, "because others have decided her worth without asking what she wants." Mrs. Nazreen looked at me for a long moment. "Very good," she said finally. "Very insightful." Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. That night, I made myself a promise. Someday, I will return. Someday, I will be the teacher. Someday, girls will answer questions without fear. Years passed like pages turning in a beloved book. I absorbed knowledge hungrily. Mathematics, literature, science, history. I learned English, then Urdu. I stayed after school to help younger students. I borrowed books I couldn't afford to buy. To support myself, I took any job I could find. I hemmed dresses for a local tailor, typed letters for people who couldn't write, tutored children from wealthy families. Every coin went into a small metal box labeled School Fund in careful letters. During my final year of high school, I caught a tall young man watching me in the university library where I sometimes studied. He worked there shelving books, moving with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with his height. When our eyes met, he didn't look away as most men did. The next day, he approached as I struggled with a stack of research materials. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Let me help." His name was Haroon. He was studying literature and dreamed of opening a bookstore that would welcome everyone, regardless of gender, status, or education. He had gentle eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled and hands that handled books like precious things. We began meeting in the library, accidentally at first, then deliberately. He recommended books that opened new worlds to me. I shared my dream of building a school for girls back home. "You'll do it," he said with such certainty that I almost believed him. "You have fire in you, Amina. The kind that builds rather than destroys." Love grew between us quietly, like a seed taking root in fertile soil. Not the desperate passion of poetry, but something sturdy and resilient. He believed in me, not as a cause or a symbol, but as a woman with purpose. When I was accepted to Teachers College, Haroon brought me a single red rose and a notebook bound in leather. "For lesson plans," he said. "For your school." I filled that notebook with dreams, curriculum outlines, classroom layouts, teaching strategies for girls who had never been allowed to speak in public. Haroon added his own notes in the margins, suggestions for fundraising, security considerations, building materials. We married the week after I graduated. The ceremony was small, just Fatima, a few friends from school, Haroon's elderly parents. But my heart felt full enough to encompass mountains. "Your parents should be here," Haroon said as we shared a simple meal in celebration. "Someday," I promised. "When we return." Afghanistan had changed in the decade I'd been gone, and yet, in the ways that mattered most for women, it remained painfully the same. The Taliban's official rule had ended, but their shadow remained, especially in remote areas like my village. We arrived with little more than our savings, my education, and an unbendable determination. My parents embraced me with tears and fear in equal measure. They had aged beyond their years, their faces mapped with lines of worry. "You shouldn't have come back," my father whispered. "It's still dangerous." "That's why I had to come back," I answered. Haroon charmed them quickly. His respectful manner, his knowledge of poetry they loved, his willingness to help with the hardest physical tasks, all of it slowly melted their resistance. We converted a room in my family's home into a classroom. We started with 5 girls, my cousins and their friends. We used books I had carried from Pakistan, pencils Haroon bought in the nearest city, a chalkboard we made ourselves. Those first students arrived with downcast eyes and silent mouths. They sat stiffly on the floor, afraid to take up space. When I asked questions, they stared at their hands. When I handed out books, they handled them like they might shatter. But children are remarkably adaptable. Within weeks, those same girls were raising their hands, debating vocabulary meanings, asking questions that made me scramble for answers. "My daughter recited an entire poem last night," one mother told me in wonder. "I didn't know she could memorize such things." Word spread. More parents brought their daughters, secretly at first, then with growing boldness. We expanded to the courtyard, teaching in shifts. Haroon taught the older girls science and mathematics while I worked with the younger ones on reading. The first sign of trouble came as a whisper. A note pushed under our door in the middle of the night. "Stop poisoning our daughters or pay the price." I wanted to ignore it. Haroon insisted we be cautious. "We need to move the school," he said. "Away from your parents' home. They're at risk too." We found an abandoned storage building on the edge of the village. With help from sympathetic neighbors, we cleaned it, repaired the roof, added windows for light. 20 girls now attended regularly. We added a computer, old and slow, but magical to children who had never seen technology. The threats increased. Rocks thrown through windows. Menacing figures watching from a distance. Parents began keeping their daughters home. We're losing them, I told Haroon one night, despair washing over me. He took my hands in his. They're afraid, Amina. But fear isn't stronger than hope, not in the long run. We just need to keep going. The next morning, Haroon left early to meet a potential donor in the nearest city, a contact from his university days who might support our work. He kissed me goodbye, his lips lingering on my forehead. I'll be back before dark, he promised. And I'll bring supplies, new books, maybe even another computer. His eyes were bright with excitement. This is just the beginning, Amina. You'll see. Those were the last words my husband ever spoke to me. Night fell. Haroon didn't return. I told myself the meeting had run long. That he'd stayed in the city overnight. That the roads were unsafe in darkness. By morning, fear had hollowed out my chest. I went to the village elders, begging for help. They avoided my eyes. A woman's place is in the home, one finally said. You and your husband brought this on yourselves. I searched alone, walking miles along the road to the city, asking every traveler if they'd seen him. On the third day, a young shepherd boy came running to my door. Teacher, he gasped. By the dry riverbed. A man. They had left Haroon's body where our students would find it, broken and displayed like a warning. His gentle hands were bound. The books he'd been carrying were scattered and torn, pages fluttering in the wind like wounded birds. Something inside me shattered. I screamed until my voice gave out, beat my fists against the earth until they bled. My parents tried to pull me away, terrified we would all be targeted next. That night, men came to the school. They poured gasoline on the walls and watched it burn. The flames reflected in their eyes as they turned toward my family's home. She's gone, my father told them. She left after her husband was killed. It was true. I had already fled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming knowledge that I would destroy everything and everyone I loved if I stayed. I crossed back into Pakistan with nothing but grief and rage burning inside me. The shelter in Peshawar was crowded with women whose stories echoed my own, women who had dared to want something more than survival. Women who had paid unthinkable prices for simple dreams. We recognized each other without words, made space for each other's silence. For 6 months, I barely spoke. I moved mechanically through days, volunteering in the shelter's kitchen because it was easier than thinking. At night, I relived finding Haroon, sometimes waking the entire shelter with my screams. A social worker named Maryam started sitting with me during my kitchen shifts. She didn't demand conversation, just quietly helped prepare food. After weeks of this silent companionship, she finally said, "There's an international education conference next month. Representatives from NGOs around the world. They need someone to speak about education access in conflict zones." I looked at her blankly. You're a teacher, Amina. Your experience matters. I'm not a teacher, I said, my voice rusty from disuse. I'm nothing. They took everything. She placed a worn book in front of me, its cover charred along one edge. This arrived last week from your village, she said softly. Your mother sent it through a relief worker. It was the leather notebook Haroon had given me, somehow salvaged from the destruction. Inside, our dreams still lived, my neat handwriting detailing lesson plans, his thoughtful notes about bringing education to places that feared it. On the last page, in handwriting I recognized as my mother's, were the words, "They burned the school. They did not burn the students. The girls remember. They wait for you. That night, I remembered Haroon's words, "They can burn buildings, Amina. But they can't burn dreams. The next morning, I found Maryam. I'll speak at the conference, I said. But I need to say more than what was lost. I need to talk about what comes next. The conference room was packed with education experts from around the world. As I approached the podium, my legs trembled so badly I feared I might collapse. These people had advanced degrees, decades of experience, polished presentations with graphs and statistics. I had only my story and a charred notebook. When the moderator introduced me, the room fell silent. I took a deep breath and began speaking, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence as I described the girls in my village, their hunger for knowledge, the small triumphs in our makeshift classroom. When I spoke of Haroon, my voice cracked. I paused, clutching the edge of the podium. "Take your time," someone called softly from the audience. I looked up to see hundreds of faces watching me with something I hadn't expected: recognition. These educators and policymakers, they understood what had been lost. Not just a husband or a small school, but possibility itself. My husband believed education was stronger than fear, I continued. I need to make his belief real. I need to finish what we started. After my speech, people lined up to speak with me. Among them was a gray-haired woman who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Wells from an American NGO called Education Without Borders. "Your story needs to be heard more widely," she said, pressing her card into my hand. "We may be able to help you find asylum in the United States. There are universities that would welcome someone with your experience and vision." I stared at the card, the possibility too enormous to comprehend. "I can't leave," I whispered. "The girls." "Sometimes," she said gently, "the longest path is the straightest one. You need safety and education yourself before you can truly help others." 3 months later, I was on a plane to America, leaving behind everything I had ever known. New York City was like landing on another planet. The buildings stretched impossibly high, blocking out the sky I had grown up beneath. People rushed past without making eye contact. The constant noise, traffic, sirens, construction, voices in dozens of languages, made my head pound. The Refugee Resettlement Organization placed me in a tiny apartment in Queens with 2 other women, Fatima from Syria and Nyala from South Sudan. Like me, they had fled violence. Like me, they carried invisible wounds alongside their visible ones. My first weeks in America were a blur of bureaucracy, forms to fill out, offices to visit, interviews to endure. Each night, I collapsed onto my narrow bed, exhausted and disoriented, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. The English I had learned in Pakistan was formal and academic. It didn't prepare me for New York's rapid-fire slang, cultural references, and impatient service workers. I found myself nodding and smiling when I didn't understand, afraid to ask people to repeat themselves. The simplest tasks became mountains to climb, figuring out the subway system, opening a bank account, finding halal food in my neighborhood. I got lost frequently, intimidated by the grid of streets that all looked the same to me. One rainy Tuesday, I stood confused at a bus stop, trying to decipher the route map. An elderly woman with silver hair noticed my distress. "Where are you trying to go, dear?" she asked. When I showed her the address for my case manager's office, she gently explained I was waiting for the wrong bus. She not only directed me to the correct one, but waited with me until it came. "It gets easier," she said as I boarded. "I promise." I wasn't sure I believed her, but I smiled and thanked her anyway. The worst part wasn't the logistical challenges, it was the loneliness. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, even in the darkest times, I had been surrounded by community. People understood the context of my life without explanation. Here, I was a curiosity at best, invisible at worst. When people learned where I was from, their expressions changed. Some grew uncomfortable, others overly sympathetic. Most asked about the Taliban or war, as if those were the only stories my country contained. Few asked about the taste of my mother's bread, the songs we sang during harvest, or the particular blue of mountains at dawn. Dr. Wells had helped arrange a scholarship for me at a small college in the city. I began taking courses in education and international development, determined to make use of this opportunity despite my struggles. My first presentation in class was a disaster. My accent thickened with anxiety, and I forgot English words I normally knew well. A student in the back row exchanged smirks with his friend. The professor, though kind, spoke to me afterward as if I were a child. That night, I cried myself to sleep, missing Haroon so fiercely my body ached with it. He would have known what to say, how to make me laugh at myself, how to turn humiliation into a story we would tell later with fondness. I called my mother from a phone center that offered cheap international rates. The connection was terrible, her voice fading in and out like a ghost. "I made a mistake coming here," I told her. "I should have stayed closer to home." "No, my daughter," she said firmly, through the static. "You are where you need to be. Learn everything you can. Then come back stronger." Survival became routine. I worked part-time at a coffee shop near campus, learning American customs through observation. I studied late into the night, determined to excel despite the language barrier. I volunteered with a literacy program for immigrant women, finding purpose in helping others navigate the challenges I was still facing myself. Slowly, painfully, I built a life. Not the one I had planned with Haroon, but a life nonetheless. A breakthrough came during my second semester, in a class on educational equity. The professor, Dr. Rahimi, was an Iranian-American woman who had fled her own country decades earlier. When I participated in a discussion about education access in conflict zones, she nodded thoughtfully at my points. After class, she invited me to her office. "You speak from experience," she said. "That's something many of my colleagues with all their theories lack." She became my mentor, helping me navigate both academia and American culture. She edited my papers, invited me to events with other immigrant scholars, and eventually helped me apply for graduate programs. "Your voice matters," she told me repeatedly, until I started to believe it again. 2 years after arriving in America, still working at the coffee shop, still sharing the apartment in Queens, I was accepted to a master's program in international education policy with a full scholarship. The day I received the acceptance letter, I took it to Haroon's favorite type of place, a small bookstore with creaking floors and books stacked to the ceiling. I sat in a quiet corner and held the letter to my heart. "We're still doing this," I whispered to him. "Together." Graduate school was both exhilarating and exhausting. I found my academic voice, writing papers that combined theory with my lived experience. I connected with professors doing groundbreaking work in education in conflict zones. I built a network of friends and colleagues from around the world, people who understood the complex intersection of politics, culture, and education. Still, America never quite felt like home. I remained on the outside looking in, observing a culture that fascinated and bewildered me in equal measure. The excess, the waste, the frenetic pace, they jarred against my upbringing. Yet I also found kindness here, opportunities one could never have imagined, and freedom to speak my mind without fear. In my 3rd year in the United States, I received devastating news from home. My father had died suddenly of a heart attack. The grief was compounded by guilt. I hadn't seen him since leaving Afghanistan. Now I never would again. The American immigration system made it nearly impossible for me to attend his funeral. My asylum status meant that leaving the country would prevent me from returning. I had to mourn from a distance, participating in my family's grief through pixelated video calls with terrible connections. That loss hollowed me out again, reminding me why I was working so hard. This separation, from homeland, from family, from cultural roots, it wasn't just my story. It was the reality for millions of displaced people around the world. I channeled my grief into my graduate thesis, focusing on educational continuity for displaced children. My research gained attention from international organizations. I was invited to speak at conferences, joining panels with experts who had once intimidated me. When I received my master's degree, I stood on the stage in cap and gown, scanning the audience out of habit, still half expecting to see Haroon's proud face, still feeling the phantom pain of his absence. Instead, I saw Dr. Rahimi, Dr. Wells, my roommates, colleagues from the literacy program, and even regular customers from the coffee shop. They weren't family by blood, but they had become something just as vital, witnesses to my rebuilding. People who had seen me at my most vulnerable and most triumphant. As I moved the tassel on my cap from one side to the other, I made a silent promise to both my father and Haroon. I would take everything I had learned here and bring it home. I would transform loss into legacy. The path forward opened slowly. The connections I made during graduate school led to opportunities with education advocates worldwide. My story, our story, resonated with donors and organizations working in conflict zones. With my new credentials and growing network, I began to plan my return to Afghanistan, not as a refugee or a widow, but as the founder of an organization dedicated to girls' education in conflict zones. Each speech strengthened my resolve. Each audience member who approached afterward with tears in their eyes or money for the cause confirmed what Haroon had always believed, that our dream mattered beyond ourselves. I connected with women from other war-torn regions, Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, Yemen. We shared strategies, resources, contacts. We held each other through anniversaries of personal tragedies, celebrated small victories, built a network stronger than any single thread within it. 5 years after I fled Afghanistan, I returned, not as a refugee or a widow, but as the founder of Daughters of Light, a non-profit dedicated to girls' education in conflict zones. This time, I didn't come alone. I arrived with international funding, a security team, architectural plans, and the backing of organizations whose names carried weight even in remote villages. I returned not to my village, but to a provincial center where government protection was stronger. The school rose from bare earth over 8 months. Solid walls, large windows, proper desks, a library filled with books in multiple languages, a computer lab, living quarters for students from distant villages, and high walls with security cameras. On opening day, 30 girls walked through the gates, eyes wide with wonder and apprehension. Many had traveled for days to reach us. Some came in secret, against family wishes. All carried the weight of being first, the ones to test whether education was truly possible for them. I stood at the entrance, greeting each girl by name, watching as they touched the walls as if to confirm they were real. In each face, I saw possibility. In each trembling smile, I recognized my younger self. By the second year, we had 60 students. By the third, over 100, with a waiting list that grew each month. We added a dormitory for girls from the most remote areas, a health clinic, vocational training for older students. Some nights, I walk the empty hallways after everyone has gone to sleep. I run my hands along the walls, feeling their solidity. I straighten books in the library, relishing the weight of knowledge at my fingertips. Sometimes, I imagine Haroon beside me, his eyes crinkling with pride. "You did it," he would say. "We did it," I would answer. They thought they destroyed me. They believed that by taking Haroon, burning our school, threatening my family, they would extinguish the flame we had kindled. They were wrong. They made me more dangerous than they could imagine, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. They forced me onto a bigger stage, connected me with powerful allies, hardened my resolve beyond breaking. Now, our graduates return to their villages as teachers themselves. They open small classrooms in their homes. They negotiate with elders for girls' right to learn. They become the revolution I once only dreamed of. Some people believe revenge requires violence, blood answered with blood, pain repaid with pain. But I discovered a more powerful vengeance. Success. Rebuilding. Creating something so profound it cannot be dismantled. My revenge lives in the confident voices of girls asking questions without fear. My revenge thrives in the dreams they now dare to claim as their own. My revenge blooms every time a girl enters our school with head high and leaves with mind expanded. They took Haroon from me. They took my home, my safety, my innocence. But they could not take our dream. For every girl who learns to write her name, for every young woman who discovers science or poetry or mathematics, for every graduate who returns to teach others, I have won. They wanted me silenced. I became a voice for thousands. They wanted me isolated. I built a global community. They wanted me broken. I became unbreakable. This is my revolution. This is my revenge. And it is only beginning.